Hello, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and today I'd like to provide you with a cool guideline that I hope will help you out when you're building your Commander decks. This is a handy mnemonic that I like to follow whenever I'm trying to decide which cards to use. Building a 100 card deck can be pretty tricky. It can even feel a little bit intimidating, especially if you're a little bit newer to the format and you're still getting your bearings. So I hope that this guideline will be useful to help you better customize your Commander experience. Pretty commonly online, you'll see a lot of advice and maybe even some deck building templates or people proposing deck building formulas to help streamline the deck building process. For example, one of the pieces of advice that you'll usually see is a lot of folks saying to make sure that you run at least X number of ramp spells and Y number of card draw effects, and at least Z number of lands. This is pretty tricky though, because formulas and templates are rarely one size fits all. The role that your commander plays can affect your deck a lot. If your commander is a source of card advantage, for example, that might affect the types of draw effects that you want to put into your deck. If your commander loves land cards, that might affect how many of them you want to put into your deck to make sure that your commander can function properly. Some commanders run very few creatures, while others play nearly half the deck as creatures. Those deck building templates and formulas never state that that's how a deck must be built, of course. They're just a baseline to work off of. Because building a deck can be really complicated. Just like the data on EDHREC, those deck building templates out there are just recommendations. But it's important for us to understand why certain types of advice are so common. So that's where the guideline of cards to use comes in. Even if you know that you want to play a lot of ramp spells or a certain number of removal spells, the question still remains, how do you choose which cards to play in those categories? So this is my guide for helping you pick cards to put into your commander decks. These are the three main metrics that I use when I'm trying to figure out which cards should make the cut. This is how to choose which cards to use. The first letter is U, and that stands for universal. Universal cards are cards that are helpful in a variety of gameplay scenarios. They're not too specific, they're not too narrow, but rather they have a broad range of applications. This is important because commander games are really high variance. You never know what you might see in any given game. You might sit down at one table against an enchantress player, an artifact player, and a graveyard player, but then in the very next game you might sit down against 3 different creature tribal decks. If your cards are too specific, then they might be really good against one of your opponents, but they won't be as useful against any of the other decks that you face. If a card only destroys an enchantment, for example, or only removes an attacking creature, or only kills flying creatures, that might not be as useful as a spell that can remove any type of creature, or a spell that can destroy any type of permanent, whether it's an enchantment, an artifact, a creature, a land, or a planeswalker. A card that only clones your own stuff might not be as useful to you as a card that can clone anything. Modal spells are another great example of universal cards. Boros Charm can protect your board, deal damage, or give a huge boost to one of your creatures. Return of the Wild Speaker works whether you have one big creature in play or a dozen small ones. By leaning away from cards that are too restrictive and opting instead for cards that are useful in a greater variety of gameplay scenarios, we ensure that we always have something to do, no matter what's going on in the game. When you choose cards that are universal, you're better able to respond to any situation that you come up against in those wild and unpredictable games of Commander. Next is S, which stands for scale. While other formats are usually a one-on-one game against a single opponent that has 20 life, here in Commander, we're facing off against multiple opponents that each have 40 life. Everything is bigger here, so that means that we should choose cards that scale up to the increased size of the game. As a really rough example, the card Bump in the Night is a perfectly fine card in a one-on-one game to cut down an enemy's life total. But in Commander, that card would barely be a drop in the bucket. Instead, Commander players often like to look for cards that affect each opponent. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is a classic example, as are cards like Smothering Tithe or Seedborn Muse. These might not be as effective against a single opponent, but against multiple opponents, these cards can be very, very powerful. And there are tons of other examples out there too, cards that really help you out against multiple opponents. This is also why board wipes are so great in Commander. Since a board wipe affects each opponent, not just one, you get a lot of bang for your buck. With just one card, you manage to affect multiple players. That's not the only way to view scale, though. For example, we have more life in Commander, so cards that use life as a resource can be extra useful here. And this is the format where we love to play those splashy spells that go big, cards that have a huge effect on the field when we cast them. One of the biggest takeaways here is to make sure that you play the cards that excite you. By choosing cards that scale up to the increased size of the Commander format, we ensure that our deck will always have a big impact in every game we play. Finally, the last letter is E, which stands for Endurance. Commander games have more players and bigger life totals, and as a result of that, games tend to go longer than they do in those one-on-one formats. And therefore, we want to make sure that we're playing cards that will provide us with staying power. That way we don't run out of steam over the course of a longer game. Some of the most classic examples of endurance cards are those very commonly talked about types, the mana ramp and card draw effects, or to state it more properly, mana acceleration and card advantage. Mana acceleration helps you gather more resources, which will help you play bigger spells more quickly and more reliably. And since the game may last a little while, you definitely want to make sure that you've got the resources to play all of your big, exciting, impactful spells. Meanwhile, card advantage helps to make sure that you never run out of things to do. If we sprint fast out of the gate, but we don't have enough endurance cards, we might run out of steam during that long distance run, and therefore we won't make it to the finish line. There's nothing worse than running out of cards in your hand and then getting stuck drawing only one card per turn over the course of what might be an hour-long game. By prioritizing card advantage effects, we're able to access and play more cards, and therefore stand a better chance of finding things that will help us vanquish our opponents. Endurance doesn't just mean ramp and card advantage, though. Since Commander games can go a little bit longer, you can also make great use of cards whose abilities provide you with steady value over a long time, or even those cards that increase in power the longer that they stick around. Additionally, Commander is not a race to the finish line. It's about being the last one standing. So another way to help make sure that your deck has endurance and staying power is by using cards that keep you alive and discourage enemies from knocking you out too quickly. And of course, cards that help you keep all of your valuable stuff in play are great examples of endurance cards too. If you build your deck with endurance in mind, it means that you'll never fall behind. By choosing cards that set you up to maintain your plan over the course of a longer game, you're better able to stay in the game and contribute to it in a meaningful way every single turn. So, when you're deciding which cards to put into your Commander deck, ask yourself if this is a card that you should use. Is it a universal card that you can use in a variety of situations, or is it maybe too narrow and too specific? Does the card's effect scale appropriately to the big size of the game? And does the card provide you with enough endurance to last throughout a longer gameplay experience? Best of all, there are some cards out there that overlap in some of these categories. There are cards that affect multiple opponents at once, but they're universal enough to help deal with several different types of problems. Or they might provide you with a lot of endurance that scales up to the number of players in the game. And there are cards out there that will help you stay alive and endure, and are universally useful in a variety of gameplay situations. All three of these factors, universal, scale, and endurance, are important for building a Commander deck. None of them is more important than the other, and different commanders will prioritize different categories. The fun part of deck building is figuring out how your deck wants to balance them. And best of all, when building your Commander decks, you get to find cards that fit into these roles and also provide awesome synergies with your Commander. At first, building your own deck can feel a little bit tricky and a little bit intimidating, but with just a little practice, I'm sure you'll soon find that building and customizing your decks is one of the most fun parts of the Commander format. I hope this guideline has been helpful at giving you some extra tools to help you better choose which cards you want to put into your Commander decks. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.